We've just seen how to solve equations in the form absolute value of x equals a number. But most of the time, the absolute value in an equation is going to be in among other things. How do we approach it in that case? Well, as a general rule, when we're solving an equation in algebra, we find the worst thing in the equation, we isolate it, and we eliminate it. So in this case, we'll use the basic solving steps to isolate the absolute value. That means get it alone on one side of the equation. Then, by thinking about the properties of the absolute value, we'll eliminate the absolute value itself. So there are two numbers with any positive absolute value. The only number with absolute value 0 is 0. And then there are no numbers with any negative absolute value. And then at that point, we'll have one or more equations that we still need to solve. We'll solve that also using the basic steps. And by basic steps, remember, we mean we can add or subtract anything. We can multiply or divide by numbers that aren't 0. Those are the steps that have no potential to cause anything weird to happen. So those are the steps that we can just kind of do without thinking about them. So with this procedure in mind, isolate the absolute value, get rid of the absolute value, and then do any remaining solving work. Let's take a look at some absolute value equations, that is, equations in which absolute values appear. So here we have 2 times the absolute value of x plus 5. So I'm trying to isolate this absolute value. I need to get rid of the 5, so I'll subtract 5 on both sides. I've got 2 times the absolute value of x is 9 minus 5 is 4. And then I want to get rid of the 2, so I'll divide both sides by 2. I've got absolute value of x is 2. And now the absolute value is isolated. I have absolute value equal to some positive number. I'm thinking x is one of the numbers whose absolute value is 2. So it could be that x is negative 2. It could be x is 2. And at this step, I'm eliminating the absolute value. And since I've eliminated the absolute value, of course, I stop writing it at this point. And now I look at what I just wrote and I say, oh, I'm done. My solution x equals negative 2 or 2. Right, so the absolute value is eliminated. I stop writing absolute value and I'm done. Okay, let's see another example where we're going to have a little bit more to do after that stage. Here we have negative 2/3 times this absolute value plus 7. Again, we're going to start out by isolating this absolute value. We cannot touch the stuff inside the absolute value at this point. Right? We can't touch anything inside the absolute value until we have eliminated the absolute value. So first we'll subtract 7 on both sides. So we'll have negative 2/3 absolute value 5x minus 1 is 3 minus 7 is negative 4. And then we'll multiply both sides by negative 3/2. So we'll have negative 3/2 times negative 2/3 absolute value 5x minus 1 equals negative 3/2 times negative 4. Those cancel and we're left with absolute value 5x minus 1 equals negative 3/2 times negative 4 is positive 6. And now my absolute value is isolated. Right, I have absolute value equals a number. And now I'm going to think 5x minus 1 is one of the numbers whose absolute value is 6. Either 5x minus 1 is negative 6, or 5x minus 1 is 6. And now I've eliminated the absolute value. And since I've eliminated it, I'm going to stop writing it. But now I need to finish solving each of these equations. So over here, I'll add 1 to both sides, and I get 5x is negative 5. Divide both sides by 5, and I get x is negative 1. Over here, I'll add 1 to both sides, and I get 5x equals 7. Divide both sides by 5, and I get x equals 7/5. So x is negative 1 or 7/5. Okay, so maybe after we eliminate the absolute value, we're done. Maybe we still have some solving work to do. We've got one last thing that can happen, and it happens in this example. So in this third example, we're trying to isolate this absolute value. So we need to get rid of the 3. We'll subtract 3 on both sides. 2 times our absolute value is 1 minus 3 is negative 2. Then we divide both sides by 2. Absolute value of 3/5 x minus 7 is negative 1. And now my absolute value is isolated. And now I look at what this equation says. It says the absolute value equals a negative number. Oh, that can't happen. There's no solution. And since I already know there's no solution, I get to stop solving. Once you know there's no solution, there's no sense in doing any more algebra. This equation has no solution, so we're done. Now, there's a general pattern here to when we're going to have no solution, when we're going to have exactly one solution, that's when we have absolute value equals 0, when we're going to have two solutions. But I really encourage you to not memorize the pattern I'm about to show you. Instead of memorizing that pattern, just think about the properties of the absolute value every time you get to the point of eliminating it. If we get the absolute value isolated, we have absolute value of something equals a number. If the number is positive, then there are two solutions. Our expression equals the number, or expression equals the opposite. If it's just 0, so if our equation is absolute value of something is 0, then the equation has one solution, namely 0. If it's negative, the equation has no solution since the absolute value can't be negative. And that means that we can stop solving at the point where we have absolute value equals a negative number. We don't need to eliminate the absolute value and do more steps in that case.